The morning light spilled through the lace curtains of the old stone house in Provence, painting the wooden floor with gold. Clara sat by the window, her fingers wrapped around a porcelain cup of coffee that had long gone cold. From the outside, her life looked enviable. A husband who ran a small but respected vineyard, two intelligent children, and a lovely home surrounded by lavender fields. Yet beneath that calm surface, the air trembled with things unspoken. She was 45, still graceful in a quiet way, the kind of beauty that came from patience rather than youth. Darren, her husband, had once adored that about her. They had built the vineyard together, spent long nights fixing accounts, pruning vines, planning new blends. But lately, his eyes seemed to drift elsewhere, and Clara could feel him slipping away one heartbeat at a time. The first time she noticed the change was the summer her younger sister Sophie came to stay. Sophie was 30, bold and full of charm. Where Clara's warmth was subtle, Sophie's burned bright. She had lived in Paris for years, chasing ambition and attention in equal measure. Her laughter could fill a room, but Clara always sensed a sharpness underneath, a hunger for admiration that never seemed satisfied. When Sophie arrived that June, saying she needed a little break from the city, Clara welcomed her with open arms. It had been years since they'd shared more than hurried phone calls. Anna, Clara's 16-year-old daughter, adored her aunt immediately. She was everything Anna dreamed of being. Glamorous, confident, and effortlessly modern. Even Darren had smiled wider that first evening Sophie joined them for dinner. But as days passed, those smiles lingered longer than they should have. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the vineyard, Clara stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. Through the open window, she could hear laughter coming from the garden. Darren and Sophie were out there playing with the dog. It should have been innocent, just family enjoying a summer dusk. Yet, something about the rhythm of their laughter felt off, too synchronized, too intimate. Clara tried to ignore the prickle in her chest, but it grew stronger with every passing day. Sophie began spending more time helping Darren at the vineyard. "She's just curious," Darren said when Clara asked why. But curiosity didn't explain why Sophie started wearing short sundresses and red lipstick to check grape quality in the fields, nor why Darren's voice softened around her. Still, Clara said nothing. She told herself she was being paranoid. After all, Sophie was her sister. Anna noticed before her mother did. At 16, she was sharper than anyone gave her credit for. She had always watched her parents closely, learning what love looked like, or what it was supposed to look like. But lately, when her father looked at Aunt Sophie, there was something different in his eyes. Something Anna had seen only in old romantic movies. Once she caught them in the kitchen, standing too close. Sophie had touched Darren's arm and he hadn't pulled away. Anna said nothing at first. She didn't want to hurt her mother. But the sight stayed with her, like a secret that burned from the inside. Meanwhile, far away in London, Clara's 20-year-old son Arthur was living a different kind of life. He studied economics at university, but his days were a blur of lectures and long shifts at a fast food restaurant. London was grey and cold, but he loved its anonymity. It gave him room to be someone other than the responsible son who always did what was expected. He had fallen for a girl named Juliet, a bright-eyed, confident classmate with a quiet sadness behind her smile. Juliet was the daughter of Anthony Delcourt, a wealthy Parisian businessman whose name appeared in magazines. Everyone at the university knew who she was. Arthur didn't care. With her, he felt free, seen in a way that London's fog could never dull. Juliet's parents had divorced when she was 15. Her mother lived in Monaco, and her father, the powerful Anthony, had recently been seen in Paris with a much younger woman. Juliet mentioned it once, laughing bitterly. "He's ridiculous," she said. "She's probably just using him for money." Arthur didn't ask who the woman was. He didn't know yet that the name Sophie would soon tie their worlds together. Back in France, Clara's world was beginning to crack. She found Sophie's perfume in Darren's car one afternoon. Not just the scent, the actual bottle, half empty, lying carelessly on the back seat. When she asked him, Darren brushed it off with a laugh. "She probably forgot it there when we went to town together," he said. But the lie sat between them like a shadow. Nights grew quieter. Darren came to bed later, sometimes after midnight, smelling faintly of wine and something floral. Clara turned away, pretending to be asleep, but her chest tightened each time. Doubt was a cruel companion. It whispered even when the world was silent. One night, unable to bear it, Clara walked downstairs. The house was dark except for the faint light seeping from the study. She moved closer and froze. Inside, Darren and Sophie sat together on the couch. Sophie was crying softly, her hand on Darren's knee. He leaned toward her, speaking in a low voice Clara couldn't make out, and then their faces drew closer. Clara's hand trembled against the doorframe. She wanted to burst in, to scream, to end the lie, but instead she stepped back. Her throat ached. Quietly, she returned to her room, crawled into bed, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The next morning, she went about her routine as if nothing had happened. She made breakfast, tended to the garden, smiled when Anna asked for help with homework. But something inside her had hardened. She began watching, listening. She noticed patterns, the way Sophie's lipstick smudged after her evening walks, the way Darren avoided eye contact during dinner, the small silences that filled the air like ghosts. Sophie, for her part, acted as if nothing was wrong. She helped with chores, chatted cheerfully, told stories from Paris. But behind her polished charm, Clara could sense a flicker of guilt. Or was it satisfaction? A week later, Anna came to her mother's room. She hesitated at the door, her eyes red. "Mom," she whispered, "can I tell you something?" Clara looked up from her book. "Of course, darling." Anna bit her lip. "I think Dad and Aunt Sophie, I think something's going on." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Clara felt her stomach twist. She wanted to deny it, to protect her daughter from the ugliness of adult secrets, but she could only whisper, "What makes you say that?" Anna's voice broke. "I saw them last night in the kitchen. They were close. Too close." Clara closed her eyes. She had suspected, she had known, but hearing it from her daughter made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Don't worry about it," she said gently, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "I'll take care of it." That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, listening to the night insects hum. Betrayal was a strange kind of pain. It didn't just break your heart, it rearranged your sense of self. How could her sister, the girl she'd once carried on her hip, do this to her? And Darren, the man who'd promised her forever? In the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming. By the next week, everything began to unravel. Sophie announced she was leaving. "An opportunity in Paris," she said brightly, avoiding Clara's eyes. Darren seemed oddly quiet, almost relieved. Clara nodded, pretending to believe the lie, but she wasn't done searching for truth. Later that night, when Sophie went out for a walk, Clara slipped into her sister's room. The suitcase lay open on the bed. Among the clothes and perfumes was a letter, handwritten, folded carefully. Clara hesitated before unfolding it. It was from Anthony Delcourt, Juliet's father. Open quote, "My dearest Sophie, I miss you terribly. Paris feels empty without your laughter. You are the only one who understands me, who sees past the mask of business and power. I've arranged the apartment for you." Clara's hands trembled. So Sophie had found herself another man, older, richer, married once again to his wealth and ego. And yet she still had time to toy with Darren. Clara folded the letter back, heart pounding. She wasn't just betrayed, she was being played in a web that stretched far beyond her home. That night, Darren returned late again. Clara waited in the living room, the letter hidden in her lap. When he walked in, surprised to see her awake, she met his gaze for the first time in weeks. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Darren hesitated. "Clara, it's late." "No," she said. "It's too late." She placed the letter on the table. His face went pale as he recognized Sophie's handwriting. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he sank into the chair opposite her, the weight of his choices finally settling in. "Did you love her?" Clara asked, her voice trembling but steady. He looked at her, eyes tired. "I don't know." That was worse than a yes. Outside, the storm broke, lightning flashing through the lavender fields. Inside, Clara sat in silence as rain battered the windows. The life she'd built, the vineyard, the family, the years of love and work, felt suddenly fragile like glass in her hands. But somewhere beneath the sorrow, a spark began to burn. She wasn't done yet. This story would not end with her broken. The storm that had broken over Provence that night seemed to wash everything clean, at least on the surface. But beneath the lavender-scented calm, Clara's world remained in turmoil. The morning after her confrontation with Darren, she found him in the vineyard, silent and withdrawn. Neither of them spoke about the letter again, but its existence lingered like a ghost between them. Clara spent her days pretending the rhythm of life had returned, managing the accounts, tending to the vines, helping Anna with her studies. But her thoughts often drifted, to Paris, to Sophie, to the unanswered questions that still twisted inside her. Why had Sophie done it? Was it jealousy, restlessness, or was betrayal simply part of her nature? Sophie had always imagined Paris as a city made for people like her. Bold, restless souls chasing dreams that shimmered just out of reach. Yet as she stood on the balcony of the Montmartre apartment Anthony had rented for her, she felt a hollowness that the city's glitter could not fill. Anthony Delcourt was everything she thought she wanted. Wealthy, charming, powerful. He owned hotels, art galleries, and more than a few politicians' favours. At 53, he carried himself with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. With him, Sophie felt desired, seen, and perhaps that had always been her weakness. But she also knew the truth. She was not the first woman to occupy this apartment. She would not be the last. Still, she told herself she could make him stay. She always believed she could make anyone stay. Anthony, for his part, was amused by her ambition. He bought her jewellery, whispered promises, and occasionally disappeared for days with nothing but a message from his secretary. When she confronted him once, he had smiled. Open quote, "My dear Sophie, in love as in business, patience is everything." She had laughed it off, but the words lingered, and yet Sophie had her own secrets, one of them still living in the vineyards of Provence. Clara days turned into weeks. Darren had stopped speaking about Sophie, though Clara sometimes caught him staring into nothing, his expression unreadable. Anna avoided her father as much as possible, her innocence cracked too early by what she'd witnessed. Clara, however, had changed. She began spending more time outdoors, walking through the fields in the early morning mist. The silence cleared her thoughts. For the first time, she started imagining a life beyond betrayal. One where she no longer waited for someone to love her right. One afternoon, while sorting through the household papers, she came across old letters from her mother, gentle reminders of simpler times. In one, her mother had written, "When people betray you, Clara, it isn't the end of your story, it's the moment you find your own beginning." Clara folded the letter carefully, her heart steadying. Maybe her mother had known that her daughters would one day walk very different paths. Across the channel, Arthur's life was quietly taking shape. Between studies and shifts at the restaurant, he found himself spending more time with Juliet. She was nothing like the other students, thoughtful, kind, but with eyes that carried sadness. One evening, as they sat by the Thames, Juliet opened up. "My father's seeing someone again," she said, her voice tight. "You probably saw her. She's all over his social events lately. Her name's Sophie." Arthur froze. He almost dropped his cup of coffee. "Sophie?" he repeated slowly. "Yes," Juliet said, frowning. "She's younger. Beautiful, I guess, but she's not good for him. I think she's using him." Arthur's pulse quickened. He knew that name too well, Aunt Sophie. For a moment he couldn't speak. He just stared at the river, its dark water rippling under the city lights. He thought about his mother, his father, the quiet pain that had settled over their home. And suddenly, everything connected. When he finally looked at Juliet, his face was pale. "Juliet," he said quietly, "I think I know her." Sophie and Anthony's world was one of champagne dinners and whispered deals. He had grown fond of Sophie, though he saw her as an accessory, something to display, not protect. Still, she played her role well. One evening, at a charity gala in the 8th arrondissement, she spotted Juliet across the room, her lover's daughter. For a moment, Sophie froze. Their eyes met, and the room seemed to still. Juliet turned away first. Anthony, oblivious to the tension, greeted colleagues and laughed at jokes that cost more than most people's salaries. Sophie smiled beside him, but her palms were cold. Later that night, as they drove back to the apartment, she said softly, "Your daughter doesn't like me." Anthony chuckled. "Juliet doesn't understand adult relationships. She still sees the world in black and white." Sophie leaned her head against the window, watching the Paris lights blur. But deep down, she wondered if maybe the girl saw more clearly than either of them. The letter back home. Clara received a letter from Arthur. His handwriting was hurried, anxious. "Mom, I think I know something you need to hear. Aunt Sophie is in Paris. She's seeing Juliet's father. Please don't worry, but I thought you should know." Clara read it twice, her heart pounding. The threads of betrayal had woven tighter than she ever imagined. Sophie hadn't just broken her family, she was spreading her chaos into another. For the first time in months, Clara didn't feel sorrow, she felt clarity. She decided she would go to Paris, not to confront Sophie in rage, but to face her in truth. To look her sister in the eyes and understand what had driven her to destroy everything sacred. Clara arrived in Paris on a cool autumn morning. She checked into a modest hotel near Montmartre, not far from the address on the letter she had once found in Sophie's luggage. That evening, she stood outside the apartment building, heart hammering. Through the window, she saw light, and a silhouette she knew by heart. Sophie. When the door finally opened, Sophie's face turned pale. "Clara," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" Clara's voice was calm, almost too calm. "I came to see my sister, to ask why." Sophie's eyes darted away. "It's not what you think." Clara stepped closer. "Then tell me what it is. Tell me why you came into my home, my marriage, and left it in ruins." The words hit like thunder. Sophie's facade cracked. "You had everything, Clara. The husband, the house, the children. I was always in your shadow." Clara's throat tightened. "So you wanted to hurt me?" Sophie's voice trembled. "I just wanted to feel loved." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "Love doesn't come from stealing someone else's life." She turned to leave, but Sophie grabbed her arm. "Wait, you don't understand. Anthony's not who you think he is. He's dangerous." Clara froze. "Dangerous?" But before Sophie could explain, a shadow moved in the hallway behind her. Anthony himself appeared, his expression unreadable. "Ladies," he said smoothly, "is everything all right?" Sophie's grip on Clara's arm tightened. And in that moment, Clara realized the truth. Sophie wasn't in control anymore. She was trapped, too. Outside, the Paris night shimmered with rain. Clara left the building, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. She didn't know what Sophie had gotten herself into, but something told her this was only the beginning. Back at the hotel, she sat by the window, watching headlights streak across wet streets. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a change. She was no longer the same woman who had once cried over betrayal in Provence. She had stepped into a larger storm, one that might destroy or redeem them all. The rain in Paris did not stop for 3 days. Clara watched it from her hotel window, every drop carving a rhythm that echoed her thoughts. Sophie's warning, "Anthony's not who you think he is," wouldn't leave her mind. She had seen fear in her sister's eyes, real fear, the kind that didn't come from guilt but from danger. On the third morning, Clara made a decision. She called Arthur. "London, Arthur." Arthur answered on the second ring, breathless. "Mom, is everything okay?" "No," Clara said quietly. "I'm in Paris." "What? Why?" "I found Sophie. She's with Anthony Delcourt, Juliet's father." Silence stretched. Then Arthur exhaled. "Mom, listen. Juliet told me things about him. He's not clean. His company launders money through shell hotels. People who cross him disappear." Clara's hand trembled. "Sophie said he's dangerous." "I'll come to Paris," Arthur said. "Tonight." Paris, the apartment. Sophie's nerves were fraying. Anthony had become unpredictable. He demanded loyalty, questioned her every move. The charm that once seduced her had curdled into control. That evening, he tossed a stack of envelopes onto the table. "Deliver these to the address I gave you. Don't open them." Sophie recognized the handwriting, numbers, false company names. "What are they?" "Accounting details," he said, voice smooth as glass. "You're the only one I trust." But she didn't believe him. Later, when he left for a meeting, she opened one envelope. Inside was a list of bank accounts tied to offshore companies, and one bearing her own name. Her stomach twisted. He was setting her up. She packed a small bag, heart pounding, and left the apartment. The only person she could think to run to was Clara. Montmartre, the sisters. When the knock came near midnight, Clara already knew. She opened the door to find Sophie drenched, shaking. "Clara, I made a mistake," she whispered. Clara pulled her inside, sat her by the heater. "Tell me everything." Sophie spoke fast. Anthony's business fronts, the money transfers, the threats when she asked questions. "He said if I ever tried to leave, he'd make sure I went down with him. My name's on his accounts." Clara's breath caught. "You have proof?" Sophie nodded, pulling the documents from her bag. These. Enough to destroy him, but they'll destroy me too. Clara looked at her sister, finally understanding. Sophie's betrayal had been born not only of envy but of desperation, a search for safety in the wrong arms. By dawn, Arthur and Juliet arrived on the first train from London. When Juliet saw Sophie, her expression hardened. "You're the reason my father's still hurting people." Sophie couldn't meet her eyes. "I didn't know what he was, not at first." Arthur stepped between them. "Right now, we need to think. If Anthony's running illegal accounts, the police will listen, if we show them evidence." Clara spread the papers across the table. "We'll take them to the authorities, but carefully. He has power everywhere." Outside, tires screeched. A black car slowed in front of the building. Sophie's face drained of colour. The escape Arthur grabbed the documents and shoved them into his backpack. "We have to move." Clara guided Sophie and Juliet toward the back stairs. They slipped out through the courtyard as rain returned, washing the streets silver. From the corner, Clara glanced back. 2 men in dark coats entered the building, Anthony's security. They ran. Down the narrow lanes of Montmartre, through alleys slick with rain. Sophie stumbled once, Clara catching her by the arm. For a moment their eyes met, sisters bound again not by love or rivalry, but survival. At the metro entrance, Arthur turned. "This way." They pushed through the crowd, ducking into a train just as the doors slid shut. The car lurched forward, carrying them into the dark tunnels beneath Paris. Only when the train began to move did Clara finally exhale. Juliet led them to a friend's empty studio on the left bank. It smelled of paint and coffee grounds, but it was safe. Arthur spread the papers on a table. "If we scan these and send them to an international paper, Anthony can't bury the story." Sophie hesitated. "If you do, he'll destroy me," Clara said softly. "He already has. Now you have to end it." Sophie nodded, tears cutting lines through the grime on her face. Together they organised the evidence, bank records, fake invoices, a list of officials on Anthony's payroll. When dawn broke again, Clara pressed send. The fall. By evening, headlines exploded across every French news channel. Business tycoon Anthony Delcourt investigated for fraud and corruption. Footage showed police outside his offices. Reporters shouted questions. Anthony, stone-faced, was led into a car by officers. In the small studio, the 4 of them watched in silence. Sophie whispered, "It's over." Clara shook her head. "No, it's beginning." Aftermath. Weeks passed. Investigators cleared Sophie after she cooperated fully. Anthony's empire collapsed. Julie inherited nothing but freedom. Clara returned to Provence with Anna and Arthur, ready to rebuild. The vineyard, untouched by the chaos, waited like a promise. One evening, Sophie arrived unexpectedly. She stood at the gate, hesitant. "I don't deserve forgiveness," she said. Clara looked at her sister, the woman who had broken her heart and then risked her life to make things right. "Maybe not," she said, "but you deserve a chance to start over." For the first time in years, Sophie smiled without pretense. "Do you still need help with the harvest?" Clara nodded. "Always." The lavender fields swayed under the sunset, and for the first time in a long while the air felt clean. The wounds hadn't vanished, but they had become part of the soil. Something to learn from, not hide. Arthur and Juliet visited that summer, their laughter echoing through the vineyard. Anna painted again, filling canvases with light. Sophie worked quietly beside Clara, learning patience. Sometimes in the evenings, Clara would look toward the hills and think of everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayals, the fear. Yet through it all, she had found something stronger than revenge. Understanding. Life, she realized, was not about the storms that break you, but the roots that hold you firm when they pass. And somewhere in the quiet fields of Provence, Clara began her second act. A full year had passed since the scandal that had shaken Paris and echoed through every corner of Clara's family. The vineyard had survived, though barely. The rows of vines stood like soldiers recovering after battle, scarred but upright. Spring sunlight warmed the fields as Clara guided new workers through the rows. The air smelled of soil and renewal. Sophie lived in the small guest house now, quiet but steady, helping where she could. Arthur and Juliet had finished university often, while Anna, almost 17, painted the sky in endless shades of lavender. Outwardly, peace had returned. But inside, Clara still felt a weight she couldn't name. The visitor. One morning, a black car stopped by the front gate. A man in a grey suit stepped out, an investigator from the Paris Financial Bureau. "Madame Villeneuve?" he asked. Clara nodded, uneasy. "I need to close one remaining matter from the Delcourt case. Some of his accounts were emptied before his arrest. The transfers came from a rural bank near here." He handed her a folder. "The signature matches someone you know." Inside, the documents showed withdrawals from a shared account, signed by Darren Villeneuve. Clara's breath caught. Her estranged husband had left Provence months before the scandal, claiming he needed time to find clarity. She had not heard from him since. The investigator continued, "It appears your husband moved funds that Delcourt used to pay bribes. We can't prove intent, but we thought you should know." When he left, Clara stood in the courtyard, the papers trembling in her hands. Darren, who had betrayed her with Sophie, had also helped the man who nearly destroyed them all. But why? The letter from London. That evening, Arthur called. "Mom, I just got something strange at the London address, a letter from Dad. It's postmarked weeks ago." "Read it," Clara said softly. Arthur hesitated, then began. "Oh, my dear Clara, I don't expect forgiveness. When Sophie came to me years ago, I thought I was saving her from ruin, not joining it. Anthony found out about our affair and used it to blackmail me into moving his money. I agreed only to protect Sophie and you. I never told you because I couldn't bear the truth to destroy what little we had left. If you read this, it means I've turned myself in. Tell the children I loved them the best I could." Arthur's voice broke. "He's gone, Mom. He confessed last week in Marseille. They found the note after sentencing." Clara said nothing. She walked outside into the dusk. The vines rustled in the wind like whispers from the past. Forgiveness in the fields. 2 days later, Clara drove to the prison outside Marseille. She didn't know what she would say, only that she needed to see him once more. Darren looked older, smaller, behind the glass. "Clara," he said, voice trembling, "I wanted to protect you from Anthony. I thought if I kept quiet, he'd leave you alone." "You protected the wrong person," she said gently, "but I believe you were afraid." He lowered his head. "Do you hate me?" Clara's eyes filled. "No. Hate would mean you still have power over me. I only wish you peace." When she left, the guard's keys clanged behind her, and with every step she felt lighter, not because justice was served, but because she no longer carried his guilt as her own. Sophie waited on the porch. "Arthur told me," she said quietly. "He did it for me, didn't he?" Clara nodded. "He thought he was saving you." Tears slid down Sophie's face. "I ruin everything I touch." Clara placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. "Then start touching things gently." That night, Sophie packed again, not to run, but to begin anew. She left for Lyon to volunteer at a rehabilitation centre for women rebuilding their lives. Before dawn, she hugged Clara tightly. "You're the only person who ever came back for me," she whispered. The vineyard in summer months later. The vineyard burst into colour again. Arthur managed the business now, with Juliet at his side. Anna painted murals on the cellar walls, stories of growth after fire. One evening, Clara walked the rows alone, the sky turning copper. In her hand she carried a small bottle of the season's first wine. She poured a little onto the soil. "For what was lost," she murmured, "and for what remains." The breeze carried the scent of grapes and wild thyme. Somewhere beyond the hills, bells tolled from a distant chapel. Clara smiled. Not the bright smile of youth, but the quiet, certain one of a woman who has finally made peace with imperfection. She had loved, been betrayed, forgiven, and begun again. Life, she realized, was never about keeping what stayed perfect. It was about tending what survived the storm. The camera drifts over golden rows of vines, bathed in the late autumn light. Birds circle above the valley, their wings flashing silver as the sun sinks behind the French hills. In the end, Clara learned that forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's understanding why things broke and choosing not to live among the pieces. The vineyard still bore scars from storms, but the roots had deepened. So had she. Sophie's letters arrived from Lyon every month, each one softer than the last. Arthur built a life rooted in honesty, and Anna painted hope onto every wall that once knew silence. Darren's name faded from the news, but not from memory, a reminder that even love can lose its way when fear takes the reins. And Clara? She stayed, tending the vines. Each bottle that left her cellar carried a label that read, "Récolte de Renaissance," the harvest of renewal, because sometimes the truest form of redemption isn't in what we rebuild, but in what we finally learn to let go. The screen fades to white as the sound of wind through grape leaves lingers, gentle, forgiving, endless.